It was the third week of November 2009, and the small town of Honor, Michigan, had already gotten its first big snowfall of the season. The snow was so thick it made everything quiet and covered up footprints within hours. Adrienne Wintall, a 32-year-old artist who drew plants from Ann Arbor, had rented a cabin along the western edge of Platte River for what she called a creative getaway. She told her sister it would be 5 days of drawing, quiet time, and no distractions. The cabin sat a quarter-mile off County Road 706, and you could only reach it by a gravel driveway that twisted through white pine and birch trees. It belonged to a retired bone doctor named Marion Vest, who rented it during certain times of the year through a handwritten ad posted at the Honor General Store. No website, no deposit needed, just cash and a signed paper saying you understood there was no internet, no indoor plumbing except a well pump, and emergency help was more than 20 minutes away in good weather. Adrienne arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-November. The last time anyone confirmed seeing her was at Beulah Fuel and Feed, a place that was both a gas station and bait shop 3 miles south of the cabin. Security camera footage showed her buying firewood, 2 gallons of kerosene, a bag of apples, and a paperback mystery book. She wore a gray wool peacoat and a knit cap with a small embroidered cardinal bird on the front. As she left, she waved at the cashier, a woman named Darlene Kapp, who later said she seemed calm, happy, and excited about the quiet time. That footage, marked 3:47 p.m. on November 17th, would become the most watched piece of evidence in the case for the next 10 years. Marion Vest expected Adrienne to return the cabin key by Sunday morning at the latest. When she didn't, he thought maybe the weather had delayed her. Snow had been falling steadily since Thursday, and the gravel driveway was known for becoming impossible to drive on. He waited until Monday, then drove his pickup truck as close as the land allowed, before walking the rest of the way. When he reached the cabin just after noon, he found the door locked from the inside. He knocked, called her name, and heard nothing. He used his spare key and walked into silence. The inside was cold, but nothing looked disturbed. A half-finished charcoal drawing of a winterberry branch sat on the small wooden table near the window. Her suitcase was open on the bed with clothes neatly folded inside. A mug of tea, cold for a long time, sat on the counter beside the stove. Her boots were lined up by the door. Her coat hung from a wooden hook near the entrance, but Adrienne was gone. Vest walked outside and looked around the clearing. Fresh snow had covered everything overnight, erasing any sign of movement. No tire tracks leading out, no footprints heading toward the road or into the trees, just smooth white silence pressing in from all sides. He drove straight to the Benzie County Sheriff's Office and reported it that same afternoon. A search began right away. Deputies, state troopers, a police dog team from Traverse City, and volunteers from the Honor Fire Department searched the woods within a 3-mile circle around the cabin. Helicopters swept over the frozen riverbanks. Divers checked the deeper parts of Platte Lake even though ice was forming at the edges. For 9 days, they found nothing. Not a scarf, not a glove, not a single sign she had ever left the cabin on foot.
Adrienne's sister, Claire Wintall, flew in from Philadelphia and held a press conference at the county courthouse. She stood beside a blown-up photo of Adrienne smiling in a summer garden, her hands stained with charcoal and ink. Claire's voice
cracked as she described her sister as kind, thoughtful, someone who sent handwritten birthday cards and remembered the names of every plant she ever drew. A $15,000 reward was offered by their parents, both retired teachers living in Kalamazoo. Tips came in here and there. A hunter said he saw a woman matching her description walking near M22 the day after she disappeared, but the timeline didn't match up. A psychic from Lansing called with coordinates that led to an old empty deer blind. By early December, the search was reduced, then stopped completely. The cabin was locked again, and Adrienne Wintall's name was added to the Michigan State Police Missing Persons database. For nearly 10 years, it stayed there. Then, in February 2019, 2 brothers on snowmobiles cutting across state forest land near the northern edge of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore hit something under the snow. They stopped to check and found a canvas messenger bag partly frozen into the ice. Its leather strap cracked and brittle from years of being outside. Inside were water-damaged pages from a sketchbook, a rusted tin of charcoal pencils, and a laminated library card with a name printed clearly across the front, Adrienne Wintall. The brothers, Lucas and Jeremy Toth, both longtime residents of Empire, Michigan, recognized the name right away. Their mother had been part of the original search team back in 2009. They marked the GPS coordinates and drove straight to the ranger station at Philip A. Hart Visitor Center. Within 12 hours, the Benzie County Sheriff's Office reopened the case. Detective Warren Kalak, who had been a rookie deputy during the original investigation, was put in charge. He remembered the case clearly, not just because of the strange disappearance, but because of how wrong it felt even back then. No struggle, no signs of leaving, but also no body, no explanation, just absence carved into winter. He requested the messenger bag be tested using the strictest forensic methods available. Several pages in the sketchbook were too damaged to save, but 3 near the middle of the book were still readable. One showed a detailed pencil drawing of a winterberry branch, almost identical to the unfinished sketch left on the cabin table. Another was dated November 19, 2009, 2 days after her arrival, and had a single handwritten note in the margin. Someone knocked last night, didn't answer, stood outside for a long time. The third page, creased and torn along the edge, had only 5 words written in rushed handwriting. He knows I'm alone here. The discovery of Adrienne's messenger bag didn't just reopen a case file. It reopened a wound that had never properly healed in the small town around Sleeping Bear Dunes. For the families who had searched those woods in 2009, for the volunteers who had walked in grid patterns until their boots wore through, the bag meant something more than evidence. It was proof that she had been out there all along, somewhere beyond the area they had searched, beyond what they had guessed about how far a person could walk in a snowstorm without a coat. Detective Warren Kalak sat in the evidence room of the Benzie County Sheriff's Office on a gray February morning, with the messenger bag laid out on a steel table under fluorescent lights. He had requested the original case file be pulled from storage, and now 3 cardboard boxes sat stacked beside him, filled with interview notes, search maps, weather reports, and photographs of the cabins inside taken the day Marion Vest reported Adrienne missing. Kalak opened the first box and began reading. The first response had been fast and organized. Within 6 hours of Vest's report, a command center had been set up at the Honor Township Hall. Search and rescue teams from 4 counties came together. The Michigan State Police sent their helicopter unit. Cadaver dogs were brought in from as far as Grand Rapids, but the search had been made harder from the start by weather and land. A blizzard moved through the area on November 23rd, dropping another 8 inches of snow and making it nearly impossible to see. The temperature dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia became a real risk not just for Adrienne, but for the searchers themselves. By November 28th, Thanksgiving weekend, the official search area had grown to nearly 6 square miles, covering thick forest, frozen wetlands, and parts of the Platte River where the water ran fast enough to keep ice from forming. Divers checked under the surface. Volunteers on horses rode trails too narrow for ATVs, but nothing was found. Not a footprint saved under a fallen branch, not a piece of torn fabric caught on barbed wire, not a single disturbance in the area that suggested she had passed through. The search coordinator at the time, a retired Marine named Gerald Foss, had written in his final report that the lack of evidence was statistically unlikely, given how intense and large the search effort was. He noted that in his 18 years coordinating wilderness rescues across northern Michigan, he had never seen a case where a missing person left so little trace. He ended with a line that Kalash underlined twice as he read it now. Either she was removed from the area by vehicle, or she never left the cabin on her own. Claire Wintall had stayed in Honor for 3 weeks after her sister disappeared, sleeping in a motel off US 31 and spending every daylight hour either at the command center or walking the woods herself. Kalak found her witness statement tucked into a manila folder near the bottom of the second box. She had described Adrienne as careful, cautious, someone who triple-checked door locks and always told people exactly where she would be and for how long. She said Adrienne had been excited about the trip, not nervous or scared. There had been no recent fights, no money troubles, no romantic relationships that might explain a sudden leaving. Adrienne's phone records showed only normal calls in the days before her trip. most of them to plant supply companies or her sister. Her bank account had not been used after November 17th. Her car, a 2006 Honda CR-V, stayed parked at the cabin with keys still in the ignition and the tank half full. Claire had also mentioned something that seemed important to Calac now, though it had been dismissed as coincidence at the time. Adrienne had called her the morning of November 18th, the day after she arrived, using the landline inside the cabin because there was no cell phone service. She told Claire the place was perfect, quiet and beautiful, but she also said something odd. She said she felt like someone had been near the cabin recently, even though Vest had promised her no one else had rented it in over a month. When Claire asked what she meant, Adrienne said she had found fresh cigarette butts near the woodpile and a set of boot prints leading from the tree line to the back window, then disappearing into the brush. She hadn't sounded scared, just confused. Claire had told her to mention it to Vest, but there was no record that Adrienne ever did. Calac made a note to find Marion Vest and interview him again. The original file showed Vest had been helpful during the investigation, giving access to the cabin, rental records, and a list of previous guests going back 3 years. He had no criminal history, no connection to Adrienne beyond the rental deal, and an alibi for the days around her disappearance. He had been in Traverse City attending a medical conference when she went missing, confirmed by hotel records and 6 witnesses. Still, Calac wanted to ask him about the cigarette butts and the boot prints, details that seemed small in 2009 but now felt like threads worth pulling. The forensic test of the messenger bag came back within a week. The lab confirmed that the pages inside matched the paper used in Adrienne's sketchbooks, several of which had been found in her apartment in Ann Arbor after she disappeared. The handwriting was verified as hers by a certified expert who compared it against samples from her journals and work contracts. But the bag itself told a different story. Trace analysis found soil stuck in the leather strap, a makeup matching the clay-rich earth found near riverbanks rather than the sandy soil common around the cabin. There were also tiny fibers, synthetic and dark blue, likely from a jacket or tarp. And on the inside lining, barely visible under UV light, were 3 small bloodstains. DNA testing was ordered right away. While they waited for results, Calac put together a new search team. This time they wouldn't rely on guesses about how far someone might wander or where a scared person might logically go. This time they would follow the evidence backward from where the bag was found. The Toth brothers had discovered it roughly 4 miles north-northeast of the cabin, in a part of the forest that had been outside the original search area. The area was thick with undergrowth, crossed by seasonal streams that flooded in spring and froze solid in winter. It was not a place someone would stumble into by accident. It was purposeful terrain, the kind you entered only if you knew where you were going, or if someone led you there. Calac requested ground-penetrating radar and a cadaver dog unit. He also contacted a forensic anthropologist from Michigan State University named Dr. Lillian Schott, who specialized in cold case recoveries in wilderness settings. Schott agreed to help and arrived in honor on March 1st, bringing with her a team of graduate students trained in careful digging techniques. They set up a base camp half a mile from the spot where the bag had been found, using land maps and weather data from 2009 to figure out likely paths of travel and where things might have moved. The snow that year had been heavy, and spring flooding would have shifted smaller objects downstream or buried them under dirt. The bag's location suggested it had been carried by runoff at some point, possibly many times over the years, before finally getting stuck against an underwater root system where the Toth brothers found it. On March 9th, the cadaver dog, a German shepherd named Rue, alerted near a collapsed section of riverbank about 60 yards west of the bag site. The soil there was unstable, worn away by seasonal flooding and shaded by a thick cover of hemlock trees that kept the ground frozen longer than surrounding areas. Schott's team began a careful dig, removing dirt in thin layers and sifting every handful through mesh screens. On the second day, they found a piece of fabric, gray wool, still in one piece despite 10 years of being outside. It matched the description of the coat Adrienne had been wearing in the security footage. Then came a button stamped with a small, cardinal bird symbol identical to the one on the knit cap she had bought weeks before her trip. By the 4th day, they had uncovered pieces of bone, small sections of a human radius and ulna buried 18 inches under the surface. The bones showed no signs of animal damage, which Schott noted was unusual, but not impossible given the depth and the frozen conditions. Dental records were requested from Adrienne's family, though everyone involved knew the identification was only a formality. The DNA from the bloodstains on the messenger bag had already come back. Testing confirmed a maternal family match to Claire Wintall. The bones belonged to Adrienne. The recovery site was photographed, mapped, and secured. Schott spent an additional week at the location searching for any other remains or personal belongings. They found a broken wristwatch with its face cracked and hands frozen at 11:43, though whether that was a M or PM, and on which day would remain unknown. They also found something else, something that changed the entire direction of the investigation. Buried 3 feet from the bone pieces, wrapped in a worn-out plastic bag, was a folding knife. The blade was rusted, the handle cracked, but still recognizable as a lockback design commonly sold at hardware stores and sporting goods shops across the Midwest. There were no fingerprints that could be recovered after so many years in the ground, but forensic analysis found tiny traces of blood on the hinge, blood that matched Adrienne's DNA profile. Kalak stood at the edge of the dig site on a cold March afternoon, watching Schott's team work with brushes and tools, each movement careful and respectful. He thought about the search in 2009, about the hundreds of people who had walked these woods believing they were looking for someone lost. Now he understood they had been looking for something else entirely. Adrienne Wintall hadn't wandered into the forest and died from the cold. She had been brought here, and whoever brought her had been close enough to know she was alone, patient, enough to wait until no one was watching, and careful enough to nearly get away with it for 10 years. The knife changed everything. Within 48 hours of its discovery, Detective Kalak had photographs of the blade sent to every sporting goods store, hardware supplier, and outdoor store within a 100-mile circle of honor. The manufacturer was identified as Timber Ridge, a mid-level brand sold mainly through regional chains in the Midwest. The model, a 4-inch lockback with a rubber grip, had been made from 2005 to 2011. Which meant thousands of them had been sold through cash registers across Michigan during that time. But it was a starting point, and Kalak had learned over 15 years in law enforcement that cases this cold didn't break from single pieces of evidence. They cracked slowly under pressure applied to the right weak points. He returned to the original case file and began re-interviewing everyone connected to Adrienne's final days. Marion Vest was first. The retired surgeon was now 73, living in a ranch-style home on the outskirts of Frankfort with his second wife, a former surgical nurse named Patrice. Kalak arrived unannounced on a Thursday morning in late March, the kind of gray day where the sky and the lake blended into each other without a visible horizon. Vest answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses, surprised but helpful. They sat in a sunroom overlooking a sleeping garden, and Kalak asked him to walk through November 2009 one more time. Vest repeated what he had told investigators 10 years earlier. He had been in Traverse City for a medical conference from November 16th through November 23rd. He had not seen Adrienne in person, only talked with her through a single phone call to confirm the reservation and arrange key pickup. She had left cash in an envelope under the doormat as agreed, and he had not returned to the cabin until the morning he found her missing. When Kalak asked about the cigarette butts and boot prints Adrienne had mentioned to her sister, Vest frowned. He said he had no idea who might have been near the property. The cabin was remote, but hunters sometimes cut through the area despite posted signs. He himself didn't smoke and never had. Kalak pushed further. Had anyone else shown interest in the cabin around that time? Had Vest mentioned to anyone locally that a woman would be staying there alone? Vest hesitated, then said he might have mentioned it casually at the Honor General store when he posted the rental notice, but he couldn't remember who might have been there. The store was a community meeting place where locals gathered for coffee and gossip, especially in the off-season when tourists thinned out. Kalak made a note and asked one final question. Did Vest own a Timber Ridge lockback knife? Vest said no. He preferred fixed-blade hunting knives and pulled one from a drawer in the kitchen to show him. It was a completely different style, an heirloom from his father. Kalak thanked him and left, but something about the conversation bothered him. Not suspicion of Vest himself, but the realization that Adrienne's presence at the cabin had not been as private as she might have thought. Small towns had long memories and short distances. Information traveled. The next person on Kalak's list was Darlene Kapp, the cashier who had seen Adrienne at Beulah Fuel and Feed. She still worked there, running the morning shift 6 days a week. Kalak found her behind the counter ringing up a customer's lottery tickets and cigarettes. When the store emptied, he introduced himself and asked if she remembered Adrienne. Darlene nodded right away. She said she thought about that girl every winter when the first snow came. She described Adrienne as polite, soft-spoken, someone who seemed happy to be alone but not lonely. Kalak asked if anyone else had been in the store that afternoon, anyone who might have noticed Adrienne or overheard where she was staying. Darlene thought for a moment, then said there had been a few regulars. Old Mr. Forster buying pipe tobacco, a couple of ice fishermen grabbing bait, and Travis Lorne, who had been standing near the firewood display, stacking split logs into bundles for sale. Travis Lorne. Kalak wrote the name down. Darlene continued, saying Travis worked odd jobs around the area, maintenance, landscaping, snow removal in winter. He was quiet, kept to himself, but reliable. She thought he still lived somewhere near Platte Lake, though she hadn't seen him in the store recently. Kalak asked if Travis smoked. Darlene said, yes, roll your owns, the cheap kind. Kalak returned to his office and ran a background check on Travis Allen Lorne, age 46, born and raised in Benzie County. No major criminal record, just a few minor problems. A drunk and disorderly charge in 2003, dismissed. A citation for trespassing on state land in 2007, paid fine. A suspended driver's license in 2012 for unpaid child support, later fixed. Lorne's last known address was a rental property on the south shore of Platte Lake, less than 2 miles from the cabin where Adrienne had stayed. Kalak felt his pulse quicken. He pulled satellite images of the area from 2009 and compared them with the search boundary maps. Lorne's home had been just outside the original boundary, close enough to walk to the cabin through the woods in under 30 minutes. He called the property management company listed on the rental records and learned that Lorne had lived there from 2008 until 2014, when he stopped paying rent and left without notice. The landlord said Lorne had been a problem tenant, often late on payments, sometimes hosting loud parties despite a no-parties rule. When asked if Lorne owned any vehicles, the landlord remembered an old Ford pickup, brown or rust-colored, and a snowmobile he kept under a tarp behind the house. Kalash requested a deeper search of county records and discovered that Lorne had filed for bankruptcy in 2015. The court documents listed his possessions at the time, including tools, a generator, camping equipment, and several knives, though no specific brands were mentioned. More importantly, the filing included a forwarding address in Traverse City, a boarding house on 11th Street. Kalak drove there the next morning. The boarding house was a converted Victorian house with peeling paint and a chain-link fence around the yard. The manager, a woman named Shelley Urbanski, said Travis Lorne had rented a room on the second floor from 2015 to 2017, but left suddenly after an argument with another tenant. She didn't have a current address, but said he had mentioned working at a marina in Sutton's Bay, doing boat maintenance and dock repairs. Kalak thanked her and made the 20-minute drive north. The marina manager confirmed that Lorne had worked there seasonally for the past 2 years, but had not shown up for the start of the 2019 season. He was considered unreliable and would not be rehired. When Kalak asked if anyone knew where Lorne lived now, one of the dock workers said he thought Travis was staying in a camper somewhere in the state forest, moving around to avoid park fees, the kind of guy who knew the back roads and hidden clearings where rangers didn't patrol. Kalak returned to Honor and called a meeting with the Benzie County Sheriff, the Michigan State Police detective assigned to help, and Dr. Schott, who had remained in the area to consult on the investigation. He laid out what he had learned. Travis Lorne was present at the store where Adrienne was last seen. He lived within walking distance of the cabin. He smoked cigarettes. He knew the woods very well, and he had a history of money problems and minor legal trouble, the profile of someone who might operate on the edges, unnoticed. Schott pointed out that the recovery site where Adrienne's remains were found required local knowledge. It wasn't a random dumping ground. It was purposeful, a location chosen by someone familiar with seasonal flooding patterns, someone who understood how the land would hide evidence over time. The sheriff authorized a warrant to search any property connected to Lorne and to bring him in for questioning. But first they had to find him. Kalak worked with the Department of Natural Resources and got access to their database of hunting and fishing licenses. Lorne had bought a small game license in October 2018, listing a P.O. box in Interlaken as his mailing address. Kalak visited the post office and learned the box had been closed for non-payment 6 months earlier. But the clerk remembered Lorne. She described him as thin, weathered, often wearing a blue canvas work jacket and a camouflage cap. She said he always paid in cash and rarely made eye contact. On April 10th, a DNR officer patrolling near the Betsy River reported seeing a camper matching the description parked in an unauthorized clearing off a fire access road. Kalash put together a team and arrived at the location just before dawn. The camper was a rusted Winnebago from the late 1980s, tilted on uneven ground, surrounded by tarps, firewood, and plastic bins. Smoke rose from a makeshift fire pit. Kalak approached with 2 deputies and knocked on the camper door. No answer. He knocked again and identified himself. After a long silence, the door opened. Travis Lorne stood in the doorway, barefoot and unshaven, wearing thermal underwear and the same blue canvas jacket the postal clerk had described. His eyes were tired but not surprised. Kalak said they needed to talk about November 2009. Lorne stared at him for a moment, then nodded slowly. He said he had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. Travis Lorne sat in the interview room at the Benzie County Sheriff's Office for 3 hours before he spoke more than 10 words. He had given up his right to a lawyer, a decision that made Kalak both hopeful and uneasy. Suspects who gave up lawyers were either innocent and eager to clear their names or guilty, and convinced they were smarter than the detectives across the table. Lorne seemed to be neither. He sat with his hands folded, staring at the grain of the wooden table, sometimes lifting his eyes to the 2-way mirror, as if he could see through it to the other side. Kalak began with the basics. Where had Lorne been on the evening of November 19, 2009? Lorne said he didn't remember specific dates from that long ago, but he knew he had been living near Platte Lake at the time, working whatever jobs he could find, snow removal mostly, clearing driveways for elderly people and small businesses in Honor and Beulah. Kalak asked if he remembered a woman named Adrienne Wintall. Lorne's jaw tightened. He said yes, he remembered her, not personally, but from the news and the search efforts. Everyone in the area knew about her disappearance. Kalak slid a photograph across the table, the security footage still from Beulah Fuel and Feed showing Adrienne at the counter with Lorne visible in the background near the firewood display. Lorne glanced at it and nodded. He said he had been there that day, stacking wood for Darlene, a side job she paid him $20 for whenever shipments came in. He didn't remember talking to Adrienne or even noticing her specifically. Kalak leaned forward. You were standing 6 feet from her for at least 4 minutes according to the timestamp. You're telling me you didn't see her, didn't hear where she was going, didn't pay any attention at all? Lorne's expression didn't change. He said the store was always busy. People came and went. He focused on his work because Darlene was strict about how the wood needed to be stacked. Kalak changed tactics. He asked about the cigarette butts found near the cabin where Adrienne stayed. Lorne smoked roll-your-owns. Had he been near that property around that time? Lorne hesitated, then said he might have been. He used to walk through the state forest at night when he couldn't sleep, following old logging trails and deer paths. It was possible he passed near the cabin at some point, but he didn't remember seeing anyone there. Kalak pressed harder. So you admit you were in the area. You admit you knew the woods. You admit you saw Adrienne at the store the day she arrived, and now we found her remains less than 2 miles from where you were living, along with a knife that matches a brand sold at every hardware store you likely shopped at. Lorne's hands unclenched, then clenched again. He looked directly at Kalak for the first time. I didn't kill her. The words hung in the air. Kalak asked, Then what did you do? Lorne closed his eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost resigned. He said he had seen Adrienne at the cabin, not just once, but twice. The first time was the evening she arrived, around dusk. He had been walking through the woods and noticed lights on in a cabin that was usually dark. He stopped at the tree line and watched for a few minutes, curious who had rented the place. He saw her through the window unpacking, moving around the small kitchen. He didn't approach, just watched. then continued his walk. The second time was the following night. He had returned to the same area, not for any particular reason, just habit. He said he liked the quiet near the river, the way the snow muffled everything. He saw her again, this time standing on the porch smoking a cigarette. He was surprised because she hadn't looked like a smoker in the store. He stayed in the shadows watching. After a few minutes, she went back inside and locked the door. He heard the deadbolt turn. He stayed outside for a while longer, maybe 20 minutes, just standing there in the dark. Then he left. Kalak felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "You're admitting you stalked her?" Lorne shook his head. "I wasn't stalking. I was just there. There's a difference." Kalak asked why he had never come forward during the search. Lorne said he was scared. He knew how it would look. A man with no steady income, a history of minor trouble, admitting he had been near the cabin where a woman disappeared. He said he almost turned himself in a dozen times during those first few weeks, but the longer he waited, the harder it became. Eventually, the search ended, and he convinced himself it didn't matter. She was gone, and nothing he said would bring her back. Kalak asked if he owned a Timber Ridge lockback knife. Lorne said he used to. He bought one at a hardware store in Traverse City in 2007 or 2008, used it for cleaning fish and cutting rope, but he lost it somewhere in the woods in 2010 or 2011. He couldn't remember exactly when or where. The interview continued for another hour, circling the same questions from different angles. Lorne's story never changed, but it also never grew.
He admitted to being near the cabin, to watching Adrienne, to owning a knife like the one found at the recovery site, but he insisted he never spoke to her, never touched her, never harmed her.
Kalak stopped the interview and talked with the prosecutor's office. The evidence was circumstantial, being near the scene, owning a common type of knife, suspicious behavior, but no physical evidence directly linked to Adrienne's death. No DNA on the knife handle, no fibers from his clothing, no witnesses placing him at the cabin on the night she disappeared. The prosecutor said they needed more before filing charges. Kalak returned to the interview room and told Lorne he was free to go but should not leave the area. Lorne stood slowly, his shoulders slumped. Before he reached the door, he turned back. He said there was something else, something he hadn't mentioned because he wasn't sure it mattered. The second night he was near the cabin, the night he saw Adrienne on the porch, he wasn't alone in the woods. He had heard someone else moving through the trees east of where he was standing, footsteps crunching through snow, purposeful, not the random wandering of an animal. He assumed it was another hiker or maybe a hunter, so he stayed quiet and eventually left. But later, after Adrienne disappeared, he wondered if that person had stayed when he left. Kalak felt his pulse spike. "Did you see who it was?" Lorne shook his head. "It was too dark and they were too far away. But I remember one detail. Whoever it was had a light, a small flashlight or maybe a headlamp, because I saw a brief flicker of it through the trees before it went dark." Kalak asked why he hadn't mentioned this 10 years ago. Lorne said the same reason he hadn't mentioned anything else. Fear, self-preservation, stupidity. Pick one. He left the building and Kalak stood alone in the hallway, his mind racing. If Lorne was telling the truth, and that was still a big if, then someone else had been near the cabin the night Adrienne was last seen alive. Someone with a light, someone who knew the area well enough to move through it in darkness. Kalak returned to his office and pulled up the original search records. He compared volunteers, deputies, and property owners within a 5-mile circle. Then he opened a separate file, one he had been building quietly over the past 2 weeks. It had background checks on everyone who had regular access to the forest around the cabin. Hunters with seasonal permits, guides who led tourists on snowshoe treks, maintenance workers for the state park, and one name that kept appearing in multiple places, a forest ranger named Carl Eustace. Eustace had worked for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources since 1998. He was assigned to the Platte River State Forest District, which included the area where Adrienne's remains were found. He had helped in the original search efforts in 2009, logging more volunteer hours than almost anyone else. He knew the land very well, every trail, every seasonal creek, every hidden clearing, and according to personnel records, he had taken a 2-week personal leave starting November 20th, 2009, just 3 days after Adrienne arrived at the cabin. The reason given was a family emergency, but no details were written down. Kalak picked up the phone and called the DNR headquarters in Lansing. He requested Eustace's current assignment and was told the ranger had retired in 2017, after nearly 20 years of service. His last known address was in Benzonia, a small village 12 miles south of Honor. Kalash thanked the clerk and hung up. He sat in silence for a moment, staring at the map of the forest pinned to his wall. Then he grabbed his jacket and keys. It was time to talk to the man who knew these woods better than anyone. Carl Eustace lived in a modest bungalow on the edge of Benzonia, surrounded by birch trees and a split rail fence that needed repair. Kalak arrived just before sunset, the sky streaked with orange and purple. Eustace answered the door wearing flannel and slippers, a mug of coffee in one hand. He was in his early 60s, broad-shouldered with a neatly trimmed gray beard and the kind of weathered face that came from decades working outdoors. He recognized Kalak right away and invited him inside without hesitation. They sat in a small living room cluttered with field guides, land maps, and framed photographs of forests in different seasons. Kalak explained that he was reviewing the Adrienne Wintall case and wanted to ask a few follow-up questions. Eustace nodded. He said he remembered the case well. It had been one of the most intensive searches he had ever helped with, and the lack of closure had bothered him for years. Kalak asked about the personal leave Eustace had taken in November 2009. Eustace frowned as if trying to remember something from a distant memory. He said his mother had gotten sick, pneumonia, and he had driven to Ohio to help his sister care for her. She recovered, but it had been touch and go for a few days. Kalak made a note and asked if Eustace had been in the area before he left for Ohio. Eustace said yes. He had been part of the first search grid on November 22nd, the day after Adrienne was reported missing. He had covered the southern area near the river with a team of volunteers. Kalak asked if he had ever been near the cabin before that. Eustace hesitated just for a fraction of a second, then said he patrolled the area regularly as part of his duties. He was familiar with the property and had checked on it sometimes when it was empty to make sure there were no problems with trespassing or vandalism. Kalak asked if he owned a timber ridge knife. Eustace stood and walked to a drawer in the kitchen. He returned with a folding knife, a timber ridge lockback identical to the one found at the recovery site. He said it was standard gear for rangers, useful for cutting rope, clearing brush, and field dressing game. He had owned his for more than 10 years. Kalak felt the room tilt slightly. He asked if Eustace had ever lost a knife in the woods. Eustace said no. He was careful with his equipment, but then he added, almost as an afterthought, that he had lent his knife to someone once, a volunteer during the search. He couldn't remember the name, but it had never been returned. The name came to Kalak 3 days later, buried in a volunteer sign-in sheet from November 24, 2009. The handwriting was hurried, barely readable, but the signature matched the description Carl Eustace had given. Owen Barrage, age listed as 34 at the time. Local address in Honor, no phone number written down. Kalak cross-checked the name against county records and found a thin file. Owen Barrage had lived in Honor from 2007 to 2011, renting a small house on the east side of town near the railroad tracks. Job history showed scattered work: dishwasher at a restaurant in Frankfurt, stock clerk at a hardware store in Beulah, seasonal labor for a Christmas tree farm outside Empire. No criminal record, no vehicle registered in his name, no property ownership. He had simply existed on the edges, the kind of person who moved through a community without leaving deep impressions. But there was one detail that caught Kalak's attention. In 2011, Barrage had been issued a restraining order by a woman named Natalie Crest, also a resident of Honor. The court documents were minimal, filed under domestic dispute, but the order required Barrage to stay at least 500 feet from Crest's home and workplace. It had been granted for 1 year and never renewed. Kalash tracked down Natalie Crest, who now lived in Manistee and worked as a dental hygienist. She agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near the harbor on a rainy April afternoon. Crest was in her early 40s, cautious but willing to talk. She said she had dated Owen Barrage briefly in 2010, maybe 3 or 4 months. At first he seemed quiet and harmless, but over time his behavior became unsettling. He would show up at her apartment unannounced, sometimes late at night, claiming he just wanted to make sure she was safe. He called her repeatedly, sometimes 20 or 30 times a day, leaving voicemails that ranged from loving to accusing. When she tried to end the relationship, he refused to accept it. He would follow her to work, wait outside her building, leave notes on her car. She finally filed for the restraining order after he entered her apartment using a spare key she didn't know he had copied. Kalak asked if Barrage had ever been violent. Kress said, "No, not physically, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made her afraid." She described it as obsessive, like he believed they were connected in a way that went beyond normal boundaries. She said he talked often about loyalty and permanence, how most people were disloyal and temporary, but he wasn't. He told her once that if he ever truly cared about someone, he would never let them disappear from his life. The words made Kalak's skin prickle. He asked if Kress knew where Barrage was now. She said she hadn't seen or heard from him since the restraining order expired in 2012. She assumed he had left the area, and she had been grateful for that. Kalak thanked her and returned to his car. He sat in the parking lot, rain drumming on the windshield, and made a series of calls. First to the Michigan State Police to run a full background search on Owen Barrage, then to the Social Security Administration to trace any job or benefit records, then to the U.S. Postal Service to check for forwarding addresses. The results came back slowly over the next 48 hours, and they painted a picture of a man who had purposely erased himself. After leaving Honor in 2011, Barrage had worked briefly at a marina in Leland, then at a lumber mill in Buckley. Both employers described him as capable but strange, someone who rarely spoke and preferred to work alone. In 2013, his name appeared on a lease agreement for a trailer park in Kalkaska, but the landlord said he had been kicked out after 6 months for disturbing other tenants. The complaints were vague. Noises at odd hours, items moved from other people's porches, a general sense of unease. After that, the trail went cold. No job records, no tax filings, no address updates. It was as if Owen Barrage had stepped off the grid entirely. But Kalak knew from experience that people who disappeared from official records didn't always disappear from the land. They found ways to survive, often in rural areas where cash work was common and questions were few. He contacted the DNR again and requested a list of all hunting and fishing licenses issued in northern Michigan over the past 5 years. The database returned more than 12,000 entries, but Kalak narrowed it by age, gender, and county of residence. One name appeared twice. Owen Barrage, age 44, small game license purchased in October 2018. Mailing address listed as General Delivery, Interlochen, the same post office where Travis Lorne had kept a box. Kalak drove to Interlochen and spoke with the postmaster, a man named Ed Klaus who had worked there for 23 years. Klaus remembered Barrage, though not fondly. He said Barrage had used the general delivery service on and off, picking up mail every few weeks. He was always polite but strangely quiet, and he never made small talk. Klaus said he stopped coming in around March 2019, and there were still a few pieces of unclaimed mail in the back. Kalak asked to see them. Klaus brought back 2 envelopes, both addressed to Owen Barrage, both from state agencies. One was a renewal notice for his hunting license. The other was a notice of overdue payment for a campground permit issued by the DNR for a site near Interlochen State Park. Kalak called the park office and learned that the permit had been issued for a basic campsite, Lot 14, located on the western edge of the park near a network of trails that connected to the larger state forest. The ranger who answered said the lot had been empty for months, but she could send someone to check if he wanted. Kalak said he would check himself. He arrived at the campsite just before noon. Lot 14 was a small clearing surrounded by thick jack pine and scrub oak, reachable by a rutted dirt road that barely qualified as drivable. There was no vehicle there, no tent, no obvious signs of recent living, but as Kalak walked around the edges he began to notice details. A fire ring made from stacked stones, the ashes inside gray and packed but not ancient, a piece of blue tarp tangled in the low branches of a tree, the same synthetic blue that had been found on Adrienne's messenger bag. A small pile of rocks near the edge of the clearing, purposeful and unnatural. Kalak crouched beside the pile and carefully took it apart. Under the stones was a shallow hole in the dirt, and inside the hole was a mason jar sealed with a metal lid. He lifted it out and held it up to the light. Inside were small objects, a button with a cardinal bird symbol, a piece of gray wool fabric, a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle. Kalak's hands shook as he unscrewed the lid. The paper inside was a page torn from a sketchbook, the edges ragged. On it was a pencil drawing of a winterberry branch, delicate and precise, signed at the bottom in small handwriting, a Wintall. Kalak stood slowly, the jar still in his hand, and looked around the clearing with new eyes. This wasn't just a campsite. It was a shrine. He called for backup and a forensic team. Within 2 hours, the area was blocked off and being treated like a crime scene. They found more hidden containers. Another mason jar with a wristwatch with a cracked face. A third jar with a small lock of hair tied with string. And under a rotted log at the far edge of the clearing, they found a leather-bound journal wrapped in plastic. The journal belonged to Owen Barrage. The entries went from 2009 to 2019, written in a tight, obsessive handwriting. Most of it was ordinary. Weather observations, animal sightings, notes about trail conditions, but scattered throughout were passages that made Kalach's stomach turn. Entries about watching people, about studying their routines, about understanding what it meant to truly see someone. One entry from November 2009 read, "She doesn't know I'm here, but that's the point. To see without being seen is the purest form of understanding." Another entry dated weeks later was more direct. "The ranger lent me his knife. He doesn't know. I'll never give it back. I don't need it for cutting rope." There were sketches in the margins, rough drawings of cabins, trees, human figures seen from a distance, and near the end of the journal, an entry from 2019. They found the bag. It was only a matter of time. I thought the river would keep the secret, but rivers talk. I can hear them now whispering her name. The forensic team photographed every page, listed every item, and took everything back to the lab. Kalach requested a rushed analysis of the DNA on the fabric and hair samples. The results came back within a week. The hair matched Adrienne Wintall. The fabric matched her coat. And on the button, they found a partial fingerprint that had survived 10 years of exposure. The print was run through state and federal databases. It matched Owen Barrage, whose prints had been taken in 2011 as part of the restraining order process. Kalach now had physical evidence directly linking Barrage to Adrienne's belongings. He had journal entries that showed stalking behavior and admitted having the knife found at the recovery site. And he had a pattern of obsessive behavior backed up by a previous victim. The prosecutor's office authorized an arrest warrant, but first they had to find him. Kalach worked with the DNR, the state police, and the U.S. Forest Service to launch a coordinated search of the state forest. They focused on areas where someone could live off the grid, places with access to water, natural shelter, and minimal foot traffic. For 2 weeks, they found nothing. Then on May 3rd, a fire lookout tower operator near the Boardman River reported seeing smoke rising from a ravine that wasn't marked on any campsite map. A team hiked in and found a small lean-to built from salvaged wood and tarps. Inside were supplies, canned food, a sleeping bag, a propane stove. And sitting on a stump outside the shelter as if he had been waiting was Owen Barrage. He didn't run. He didn't resist. When the officers approached, he simply stood and raised his hands. His face was thin, his hair long and matted, his clothing stained and torn, but his eyes were clear, almost calm. They put handcuffs on him and read him his rights. On the hike back to the access road, one of the officers asked him why he hadn't run when he had the chance. Barrage looked at him and said, "Because running only delays the inevitable. I learned that from her. She ran and it didn't matter." The officer asked what he meant. Barrage smiled faintly. He said she tried to leave the cabin that night. "I saw her through the window packing her bag, moving quickly. She was afraid. I could feel it even from outside. So I knocked. I wanted to tell her she didn't need to be afraid of me. But when she opened the door, she looked at me like I was a monster. And I realized she was right." Owen Barrage's confession came in pieces, delivered over 3 days of recorded interviews in a secure room at the Michigan State Police Post in Traverse City. He spoke without emotion, his voice flat and measured, as if he were describing someone else's life rather than his own. Detective Kalach sat across from him, a digital recorder running, a prosecutor and a court-appointed psychologist watching through the glass. Barrage began with the night of November 19, 2009. He said he had been walking through the woods near the Platte River, a route he traveled often when sleeplessness kept him awake. He had seen lights in the cabin and stopped to watch, curious about who had rented the place. He saw Adrienne through the window, moving around the small kitchen, her silhouette framed against the warm glow of kerosene lamps. He said he felt drawn to her, not in a romantic way, but in a way he couldn't fully explain. She seemed solitary, self-contained, complete. He watched for nearly an hour before leaving. The next night he returned. This time he moved closer, circling the cabin from different angles, studying the layout, the way she moved. the rhythm of her routine. He saw her step onto the porch to smoke a cigarette, and he was surprised because she hadn't seemed like someone who smoked. He stayed hidden in the tree line, motionless, barely breathing. When she went back inside and locked the door, he remained outside, standing in the snow, listening to the silence. He said he felt peaceful in those moments, like he was part of something larger than himself. But then he heard her moving inside quickly, frantically. He heard drawers opening, the rustling of fabric, the sound of a zipper. He moved to the window and looked in. She was packing her bag, her hands shaking, her face pale. He realized she knew someone had been watching. Maybe she had seen him, or maybe she had simply felt it, the weight of unseen eyes. Either way, she was leaving, and the thought of her leaving, of her disappearing before he could understand why he felt connected to her, filled him with something he described as panic. He knocked on the door. He said he didn't plan to hurt her. He just wanted to talk, to explain that she didn't need to be afraid. But when she opened the door, just a crack, the chain still latched, she looked at him with an expression he would never forget. Not anger, not confusion, but pure, primal fear. She tried to close the door, but he pushed against it, breaking the chain. He said he didn't remember making the decision to push. His body just moved. She stumbled backward, tripping over her suitcase, and he stepped inside. He told her to calm down, that he wasn't going to hurt her, but his words only seemed to scare her more. She grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, a small paring knife, and held it out in front of her, her hand shaking. He said he tried to take it from her gently, but she resisted, and in the struggle, the blade cut across his palm. The pain was sharp and immediate, and something inside him changed. He pulled the knife from her hand and hit her once, hard, across the side of her head with his closed fist. She collapsed. Barrage paused here, his gaze distant. He said he stood over her for a long time, watching her breathe, watching the blood seep from a cut above her temple where she had hit the edge of the table on her way down. He said he knew in that moment that everything had changed, that there was no explaining this away, no returning to the version of himself that had existed 5 minutes earlier. He checked her pulse. She was alive but unconscious. He looked around the cabin at her belongings, at the sketch on the table, at the life she had brought into this space, and he made a decision. He couldn't let her wake up and identify him. He couldn't risk the consequences of what he had done. So he carried her outside into the cold and the dark, and he walked. He knew the forest well enough to move without a flashlight, and he walked quickly, his arms aching under her weight. She stirred once, murmuring something he couldn't make out, and he stopped to check if she was waking. She wasn't. He continued walking until he reached the riverbank, a place where the water ran fast enough to keep the water from freezing completely. He laid her down on the snow-covered ground and searched his pockets. He found Carl Eustace's knife, the one the ranger had lent him weeks earlier during a trail maintenance project. He had never returned it. He said he didn't want to use the knife, but he couldn't leave her alive. If she survived the cold, she would tell the police what happened, and his life would be over. He told himself it was already over the moment he pushed through that door, and this was simply the logical conclusion. He opened the blade and knelt beside her. She opened her eyes then, just barely, and looked at him. She didn't scream, didn't fight, just looked at him with an expression he couldn't name. Resignation, maybe, or sadness. He pressed the blade to her throat, but his hand wouldn't move. He sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, frozen by indecision. Then she stopped breathing on her own. He checked for a pulse and found none. The cold had taken her while he hesitated. He said he felt relief and horror in equal measure. He hadn't killed her with the knife, but he had killed her by bringing her out into the frozen night, by taking away her chance to survive. He buried her in a shallow hole near the river, covering her body with snow and branches. He took her messenger bag, planning to get rid of it but couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It felt like evidence of her existence, proof that she had been real. He kept it along with small items he took from the cabin, a button, a piece of her coat, a page from her sketchbook. He said he visited the burial site dozens of times over the years, adding to it, moving things, trying to create something that felt like remembrance rather than hiding. Kalak asked why he had helped in the search efforts. Barrage said it was the only way to stay close to the investigation, to know what the authorities were finding or not finding. He said it also felt like penance, a way to pretend he cared about bringing her home when he was the reason she was gone. When Carl Eustace asked to borrow a knife during the search, Barrage realized he still had the ranger's blade in his coat pocket, the one he had almost used. He couldn't return it covered in his own blood from the cut on his palm, so he claimed he had lost it. Eustace didn't press the issue. Barrage got rid of the knife months later, burying it near the site where he had left Adrienne, a symbolic gesture he couldn't fully explain. The forensic analysis backed up Barrage's story. The blood on the knife matched both Adrienne's DNA and Barrage's, matching his description of the struggle. The fibers on the messenger bag matched clothing Barrage had worn, documented in photographs from the 2009 search efforts. And the location of the remains lined up with his description of the burial site, later disturbed by seasonal flooding that carried some items downstream. On June 14, 2019, Owen Barrage was formally charged with second-degree murder, felony murder during the commission of a home invasion, and hiding a death. He pleaded guilty to all charges as part of an agreement that spared him a trial. The plea hearing was brief. The judge asked if he understood the consequences of his plea, and Barrage said yes. The judge asked if anyone had forced or threatened him, and Barrage said no. Then the judge asked if he had anything to say to the family of Adrienne Wintall, who sat in the front row of the courtroom. Claire with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her parents on either side of her. Barrage turned to face them. He said, "I can't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I can only tell you that I think about her every day and I will for the rest of my life. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but I don't have better words." Claire stood. She looked at him for a long moment, her face showing no expression, then spoke in a voice that was steady and clear. "You took my sister from us, but you don't get to keep her memory. That belongs to us." She sat back down and the judge sentenced Barrage to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Detective Calac attended the sentencing, but left before the press conference that followed. He drove back to Honor, past the general store and the gas station, past the turnoff to the cabin where Adrienne had spent her final night. He drove to the recovery site, now marked with a small wooden cross placed by Claire and her family. Someone had planted wildflowers around the base, their colors bright against the dark earth. He stood there for a long time, listening to the river move over the stones, thinking about all the ways a life could be interrupted, all the ways a person could vanish and still leave echoes. Claire had told him privately after the hearing that she didn't feel closure, not in the way people talked about it on television. She said she felt something quieter, more like acknowledgement. Her sister's story had an ending now, and the truth, however painful, was better than the silence that had come before. Calac returned to his office and filed his final report. In it, he wrote that the case had been solved not through a single breakthrough, but through the building up of small truths, each one leading to the next, each one requiring someone to pay attention. He noted that Adrienne Wintall had been failed by closeness, by the assumption that danger lived far away, rather than in the quiet spaces between neighbors. But she had also been honored by persistence, by the refusal of her family and investigators to let her name fade into the list of the forgotten. On a cold morning in November 2019, exactly 10 years after Adrienne disappeared, a memorial service was held in honor. More than 200 people attended, filling the small community center beyond capacity. Claire spoke about her sister's love of plants, her careful illustrations, her quiet humor. A local choir sang and a retired teacher read a poem about winter and remembrance. At the end of the service, attendees were invited to light candles and place them on a table beneath a photograph of Adrienne, the one from the security footage where she waved at the camera, her face open and unafraid. The candles burned long into the evening, small flames against the gathering dark, proof that even in the coldest season, light could still be carried forward. Make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video. Your support helps bring attention to cases that might otherwise be forgotten. What cold case do you think deserves more attention? Comment below. Every unsolved case represents a family still waiting for answers, still hoping for the closure that finally came to the Wintall family after nearly a decade of searching.